Jeff Alberts.
Eric Helms.
Man, we are talking today because, as the thumbnail and the title indicates, the differences in our volume. It is the fight of the century. It is Godzilla versus King Kong. It is the destruction of all things we know and love in natural bodybuilding. How are we ever going to recover from it?
I don't know, man. We're just polar opposites.
Well, you know, one thing that is the same about us is we both get the same comment in a slightly different form as the most common comment on our current YouTube vlogs. The most common one I get, what do you get? People are confused why you're doing so little volume, and they're confused why I'm doing so much volume. That seems like people seem to think that there is a very specific volume that everyone is supposed to do. Jeff, you've been coaching for over a decade now. Do you give all of your clients the same amount of volume?
No. It's very rare I give someone the same amount of volume that I'm doing.
And honestly, it's the same for me. I don't necessarily want to be doing this high of volume. I have been experimenting with high volume for about 13 years now. But when I program, I start with what kind of volume you're currently doing, and then I try to assess whether or not they're currently making progress, plateaued, or if they are somewhere in between. And then is there efficiency that I can improve first before we start to turn over the rock of potentially doing more volume if they are plateaued. So it always ends up being individual. And I have also found that it's the very rare client that is doing as much volume as I am.
You do a lot of volume. I mean,
I do.
I don't think I have too many people doing your amount of volume either. It's usually in that middle area.
But I'd say we're both in different directions, a couple standard deviations from the norm at least, which makes the disparity between us seem huge. So, Jeff, how much volume are you doing per week on average for most of your muscle groups?
6 to 8 sets. I
6 to 8
think
sets.
back is probably like the most volume I got going right now, and it's 9 sets. That's
Right.
the high volume body part. Like triceps, direct tricep work, 3 sets. I mean, if we count indirect, then we're kind of up to like 9 sets. Add up like 6 sets of pressing plus the 3 direct sets of tricep press downs.
Because actually, that's the way they count volume in the research, which I think some people miss, is that they count all indirect and direct work together. So you don't have any muscle groups right now, even counting indirect work, that is double digits. That's interesting because I do a little bit more than that. So my volume right now is
Your volume in one day is my entire week.
for certain muscle groups it is. For certain muscle groups it is. Other ones, I'm only doing 9 sets of calves per week, Jeff. But yeah, my erectors and my calves are the only exercises that are getting single digit, and that's 9 and 8 sets respectively. My arms are getting a pretty silly amount of volume. And also, here's another way. Like I do, because I have so much work I have to get through, I do a fair amount of drop sets and I do a fair amount of rest pause. So if we count rest pause and drop sets on a 1-to-1 basis, and also if we count long head work I get from like pullover type movements, I have 45 sets of triceps and 36 sets of biceps in a week.
Yeah, it takes me 6 weeks to get to that.
Like I said, I'd love to be you.
And I'd hate to be you. You know what? No, my wife would hate me if I was you.
And this is why I have to do so many drop sets and rest pauses to try to antagonist paired sets. I have to be efficient.
And that's hard. That's not easy.
It is. It is. And it's not something that I've just done arbitrarily or that I'm a busy guy. You know, it's not something that I would prefer to do. To give an easier volume comparison. So you're doing 6 sets of quads, right?
3 sets of leg extensions on one session. That's a quad day. And then the other one is 3 sets of leg press.
So I'm doing 16 sets of quads per week. And on my first leg day, I do 4 sets of hack squats, 4 sets of leg extensions. And then on my second leg day, I do 4 sets of leg press and then 4 sets of either leg extensions or sissy squats, depending upon which gym I'm in. So I'm 2.5 times your volume on quads. I think that's an easy comparison. And my lower body doesn't seem to need as much volume, but my lats, for example, I do 28 sets. My pecs, I do 26 sets.
Yeah, you definitely got to be creative to get that volume in, and for it to be effective and efficient, and in order to recover as well.
Absolutely. I think another thing that we should discuss and compare is that I don't think you are sandbagging it in terms of volume. And the reason why I know that is we've had the opportunity to train together many times. You know, I lived in California, just an hour away from you from, you know, the first 3 years of 3DMJ. And I've seen you do the same stuff that I've done, and I'm fully recovered in 48 hours, and you are not.
No, man, I'm like on the couch, like Diet Coke in my hand. Let's watch some NBA basketball or something. I need to chill out before I get back in there. And otherwise, I mean, I could train sooner, but performance isn't going to be there. I'm going to feel like garbage.
Yeah, and for me, it's the opposite. Like, I have relatively fast recovery rates. I don't fatigue even within session quite as much. So in my mind as a coach, I think the same way you do, and I've been heavily influenced by your philosophy of supply and demand. The first question is, can I recover from the amount I'm currently doing? Because if I can't, then it doesn't matter if I could theoretically benefit from it, because I can't do it. Before we started recording, you were talking about how you did some lat pull downs, and how are you feeling afterwards? And tell me that story.
I did one top set, 4 reps, 195 pounds, and I still had 3 or 4 in the tank. But it was a load that I haven't touched in a long while. So it was hard. And I've got a good pump just from those 4 reps. But literally after doing 2 more back off sets, and that was the only exercise I did that day. The next morning, I was like just physically tired, and my back was like not sore, but I can tell that it was fatigued. So it doesn't take a lot of sets to like wreck me. But at the same time, it's like you said, like I'm training with plenty of intention behind it. Like every single rep I do, there's like 100% effort into it.
Yeah, that's one thing, is I think you are a master of bringing intentionality to not just each set in terms of like what's my failure point, but also each rep.
Well, yeah, because the 4 reps, like they're like about 3 second negative. Not that I'm counting 3 seconds in my head, but in my mind, I'm thinking, let me fight gravity here. So I'm controlling it all the way up and getting that benefit there. And then it's like a subtle pause. So there's no momentum coming back down. Like that concentric is just very controlled. It's not purposely slowed.
What's the average proximity to failure, would you say, in your training right now?
You know, we're 1 to 2. Last set, probably failure. If it's an exercise that it's safe to do it. You know, like a lateral, I'm going to go to failure. Even on that pull down, that last set went all the way to failure. So I'm making sure bringing in as much muscle fiber as I can and generating that stimulus, because it is a little set volume.
And I think the misconception that some people who have maybe more of a high volume bias, or think that everyone should be doing at least like 10 to 20 sets, would be that, all right, well, if you're only doing 6 sets, even if you're training to failure, then you would probably be recovering, and we should be doing more. But it sounds like you are pushing your recovery limits at the moment. Like I said, when I'm programming for someone, I'm looking at, could they hypothetically recover from more volume? That's the first question before I answer the question of, do I think they could benefit from it? Like, if they can't recover from it, it's a non-starter. On the other side, the people who would think like, Eric, you must be sandbagging because there's no way you could get through that amount of volume and be training with intent and, controlling your eccentrics, pausing in a stretch position. God, man, I wish that was the case. But I am also pushing probably an average of a 1 RIR and 9 RPE in my training. Every single one of my exercises in my program, the first set starts at either a 8, 9, or a 10 RPE. And the ones that start at an 8 are like my compound lower body exercises. Those start at an 8, and then by the last set, they get up to a 9 RPE. And, y'all can follow me on Instagram, or even just look through the old videos. Like, I post all my sets. I don't think I'm sandbagging my RIRs. People need to understand that neither one of us is sandbagging it, and that we are both pushing our recovery capacities, even though we're both training at the same average RIR, but drastically different volumes.
Question for you is like, do you have any intention of going from 36 sets of biceps to 40?
I tell you what, Jeff, I'm results oriented at this stage in my career, in my maturity level. I am willing to turn over stones to make progress, and I'm highly motivated. If I truly thought, and I don't think it's going to happen, if I truly thought the answer to me breaking this next plateau is doing more, I would go that route. I think a good answer to your question is that you always want to go with efficiency first. And even if you might end up being a high volume responder, you want to make sure that all the work you're doing is as efficient as possible so that you only need to do a certain amount of volume.
I agree.
So it makes a lot of sense to me to work on efficiency, work on proximity to failure, focus on intensity, intentionality, and high quality movements, performed well, and good exercise selection before you start to turn the volume dial up. But I still think you want to start with a reasonable volume.
Would you say it's going to be on the lower end, would you say, though? So you're not doing 20 sets of crap work. It's like maybe start on the low end, 10, maybe even lower than that, just to work on the skill level, get proficient. And then from there, like the way I see it is like, hey, let's get the skill where it needs to be. If it's right where it needs to be, it's now, hey, let's more focus on load and rep now. Let's get the performance to elevate before we start messing with the set volume and all that. And if that's moving well, then there you go. You're moving up from that baseline. Once you plateau, then it's, why are we plateaued? If it's fatigue, then like we talked about earlier, let's not add volume. Like maybe we need to fix some things, get more proficient again. Maybe we need to reduce some fatigue, deloads, that type of thing, and then rinse and repeat it. But I mean, if you're getting to a point where like I'm banging my head against a brick wall here. My loads and reps are fine. They're moving. But I'm not seeing any results here, and I'm not tired. It's like, by all means, let's add some work in there. Because now you're skilled, you know how to progress, you're just ready to just tackle more volume at that point.
I 100% agree. And for me, I was plateaued in performance. Like I saw some initial strength gains from using a lower volume powerlifting style upper body approach, but then I plateaued. It's kind of like I got the most I could get out of reducing fatigue, and I was always expressing my top end strength. And it was right around like a 3-plate bench. And then what was required of me to get up to my peak bench of 363 was benching every time I trained, And then the parallel for my muscularity was doing a lot more because, exactly like you said, I had optimized everything else. I had turned over so many stones at different training paradigms, exercise selection, attacking weak points from both a powerlifting and a bodybuilding perspective.
You went through the checklist.
I did.
And it's like, okay, it's just everything's pointing to more volume.
Yeah. And I think I have to take some blame for why people think there is a universal volume recommendation, because there's a big difference between writing a book that tells people, hey, here's how you set up training initially, here's how you want to coach people, here's what we understand from exercise science, which provides population-based data, versus coaching. And as much as I try to talk about it, and we talk about it so much on the 3DMJ podcast, people get really attached to numbers and very specific answers. And it's human, I get it. But if you read my book, it says, most people should be doing 10 to 20 sets. It really does mean most people. And that's like, 2/3 of people, but 1/3 of people is a lot of people. I think here's a really cool comparison. So it's that 10 to 20 sets recommendation comes from 2 different meta-analyses, one published in 2017, one just a couple years old, where they did comparisons of different categories of total work, indirect and direct, like we were talking about, sets per week, mostly in studies going to failure, but mostly with lower training ages. And we generally see this kind of diminishing dose response that starts to plateau somewhere in that 10 to 20 range. So on average, it probably makes sense to be doing, 10 to 20 sets per week. But there was a pretty cool study that was done in 2019 by DeMoss and colleagues, where they compiled some data from what's called a within subject design, which means they had each person training both of their limbs in different ways. So basically each person is their own control. So the same genetics, really cool, same nutrition, same sleep. It's a great way for hypertrophy to assess these kind of unique responses. And in one group, they looked at all the legs that trained 2 or 3 times per week for 3 sets. So 6 to 9 sets of quadricep work. Exactly Jeff's volume. And then the other group consisted of the leg that did that 5 times a week. So 15 sets per week. Almost exactly my quadricep volume. And what they found is that about a third of people got a similar response from 6 to 9 sets as they did to 15 sets. Another third of people, though, actually responded better to doing lower volume. And that's your Jeffries. And then another third of people responded better to doing higher volumes. So, sure, when we take a big step back and we look at all the research that's been done, we see this dose response curve that starts to plateau. But like you said, everyone has a different baseline. And everyone has a different kind of top end in where they plateau. And I'm right shifted and you're left shifted. And we have good evidence to indicate that these averages are not everyone because they're an average. You're not an average from a study. You are an individual data point. And that's what coaching is. And I think that's probably the key thing that's missing in all these comments that we both get.
Here's a question for you. Can I train myself to be where you're at? I know my answer. I've already experimented with that, but this is a question I'm sure people are going to be asking. Well, if I'm doing 8 sets now, I might get even better results if I do 24 sets.
So I think we have to remember that even though there are these differences between people, we are incredibly adaptive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your ability to handle certain training is necessarily going to benefit you in the same way that it would benefit someone else. And I think what we'll talk about is that there's 2 responses you get from training. There's fitness and fatigue. And some people are hyper responders to both. They train a little bit, they get a lot of fatigue and a lot of stimulus. That might be your Jeffs. Some people, they get a lot of stimulus and not a lot of fatigue. That might be like your Doug Miller, right? We've seen the stuff he's done, 30 set reps on deadlifts every week to failure. Many people would not be able to physically get through that training, let alone respond to it or not have subsequent fatigue the next week. Some unfortunate souls are just low responders, and it sort of doesn't matter how much fatigue they're getting because they're just not getting a lot out of it. I do think, like, if you were like, listen, I want to become an endurance athlete, you would be able to handle it. You'd be pretty good, but I think you would also respond differently than other endurance athletes.
Sure.
There was actually a really cool study where they did fiber typing on endurance athletes. And the ones that had more type 2 dominant fibers, they did not respond well to overreaching. So they went through an overreaching phase and they did more and more running. And the athletes with more type 2 fibers who overreached didn't benefit from it, while the more slow twitch athletes, they actually did get a positive overreaching response. So I'm not saying it all comes down to fiber type, but I think that could be one of the factors where type 2 fibers, they do respond better to a stimulus, but they also fatigue faster and recover slower. So you combine that with the fact that you're also 13 years older than me, 13 years older than you used to be, that you're close to your genetic ceiling, so you're probably closer than I am. And you think about your training background, my training background, and also the life demands that we both have. I think when you combine those physiological factors with the context and where you are on your journey, you get a different calibration of both what's the appropriate response you should get for fatigue and stimulus. So the answer is, I think you could get to the point where you could handle a lot more volume. I don't think you'd benefit from it. But let's take it back to an era where we both had a fair bit left to grow, and how we figured out that the most efficient path for us each was to do maybe not quite as much and to focus more on execution, intensity, and efficiency in your case. And then for me, to do that and a lot more. So what were your personal experiments that led you to realize that you maybe didn't need as much as most people?
Well, of course, you know my history with like 16 years worth of HIIT. And I mean, I wish I can erase a lot of those years. But prior to that, I was doing 5-6 days of training per week with a lot more volume. And I can't recall exactly how many sets per week I was doing, but it was a lot more than I'm accustomed to doing now. And I wasn't seeing any response. And that was just because I wasn't well fueled. I was a broke college kid at the time. So I wasn't eating enough. So I was just struggling to see any progress. Then I got introduced to HIIT, and naturally it's like the volume went way down, my intensity went way up. And I think the thing about HIIT is it did teach me the skill of intensity, of pushing close enough to failure And the gentleman I worked with, was like big stickler on form. So I improved those areas, but I went from maybe 2,000 calories a day up to 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day. So it's like in the first 3 months, I just shot up like a rocket. Now, I always kind of wonder, but I don't like lose sleep over this. Like, I wonder if I was to go back in time when I was training 5 or 6 days a week with maybe the same skill level that I learned with the 4,000 to 5,000 calories, would I have made the same or even more gains with that amount of volume? And I will never know the answer to that. The what if questions.
Well, Jeff, my intuition that is informed by my experience and some data is that I think you wouldn't have responded as well as you did to the lower volume approach if that would have been the case. I actually had a pretty extended low volume phase, but I did max OT training for almost a full year. And for those who don't know, this was popularized by Jeff Willett, Skip LaCour. Brad used to train this way, and it's focused on compound movements, a 1 times per week frequency for most muscle groups, a body part split, and you're training mostly in the 4 to 8 rep range.
Yeah.
And you're basically only getting 6 to 8 sets per muscle group. Like you're pushing towards concentric failure, and you need a spotter to do it, right? I made great initial progress, and then I plateaued. I was focused on both bodybuilding and powerlifting outcomes. So one of the things I did is then I tried something that I would describe as West Side influenced. I was basically benching really heavy, low volume once per week, and then doing some dynamic effort and repeated effort work on another day of the week. So my total bench volume was maybe only, again, 6 to 8 sets, but now I was doing a little bit of bands and chains. I was doing powerlifting arch, all that. And I had that kind of experience where my bench was just hanging around 300 pounds, 315 at most, and then dip back down for years, basically only changing with body weight. And my upper body was essentially plateaued. I was a little bit bigger in my 2009 season than 2011 when I had now had a couple years of trying lower volume. Probably the most striking example was when I went to train with you. And we did that for the off season prior to my 2011 season. And this is where I noticed 2 things: that my upper body responds differently than my lower body, and that I respond differently to training than you. Because I remember that my shoulder press, my dumbbell shoulder press, had peaked prior to that point with slightly higher volume than we were training with, you and I together, only 3 days per week. I hit 100 pounds for a triple on dumbbell shoulder press. And it actually regressed down to me doing sets of like 6 to 8 with 80-pound dumbbells with you, when it had started around 90.
And to give a little context here, it's like when we were doing overhead presses, because it was like,
yes,
go to concentric failure. I'm going to give you a forced rep or 2. And then now I'm going to tell you to do a static hold.
What stood out to me is that, like my RDLs, they were going up, like just a linear curve. And that I only recently broke the RDL PR that I hit with you.
You owe me a bar because you broke the bar.
I forgot about that. Yeah, that's how intense it was, folks. I broke Jeff's bar. But my leg progress was continuing on the same trajectory as it had been. And my 2011 stage pictures, it was when I really was like, man, I'm so unbalanced. My upper body is small, my lower body is big.
Yeah, your upper body was visibly smaller.
Yeah. My 2011 season was probably my least successful in terms of did my physique improve from 2009. And the difference is that I had been doing low volume West Side, max OT, and then training with HIIT. So I gave it a really good effort.
It's a good sample size.
Yeah. When I finished that 2011 season, and I was starting to then add food back in, and I noticed I wasn't regaining the fullness. I remember my birthday in 2011. I saw some pictures of me on the back porch, and I was like, dude, it looks like I don't lift in the upper body. And I went, you know what? I need to try something else, because I've done everything. Like Jeff is taught me how to really take it to the house, keep momentum under control, use really good technique. I've experimented with different paradigms of training, periodization systems that don't change volume, but I was working with all different kinds of approaches for both powerlifting and bodybuilding, and it just wasn't happening. I'd been in a surplus, in a deficit, wasn't happening. I'd been as heavy as 220 pounds, and I'd been as light as 175 on stage. So I started doing 5x10 shoulder press, chest press, row, lat pull down 3 days per week. So 30 sets of pressing 30 sets of pulling, and I blew up. It was the closest thing that I'd had at that point, 7 years into training, that I had as a newbie. And I got back up to the biggest my upper body had been in 2009, and then I surpassed it. And people really started to notice. It was at that point where I was like, okay, I clearly need to be doing more upper body work. And then my bench plateaued a little bit higher in like the 330 range, 340. And then I went, well, you know what? Let's push it even further. And I started benching 5 to 6 days per week, heavy. And that was when I hit a peak bench of 363. That was the confirmation I needed. I was like, shit, like if I'm recovering, I seem to benefit from more volume, at least in the upper body.
And I even experimented with higher volumes, like undulating it, okay, let's ramp up the set volume throughout a meso. So I experimented with that and gave it a fair shake. And all it did was just beat me up. Achy joints, always fatigued and tired, and like my physique doesn't look any different. This obviously doesn't work. It's too much. So that just taught me to settle back down where I normally am and just focus more so on just quality and performance.
So I think we've learned over time what works best for us. And the good news, dear listener, is that you don't have to sign up for a within subject design study at your local university. And you don't have to spend 8 years before I really noticed this consistent pattern. And it took Jeff a fair amount of time as well, experimenting in both, maybe getting a little too dogmatic. I think the good news is you got dogmatic around something that worked, at least. It may have not been perfect for you, but HIIT obviously was a good enough fit that you fully bought in, and I think it was probably more important. I think, looking back on your history, it's probably more important that you got out of the dogma of HIIT as a coach than it was as an athlete.
100%. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I think for the listener, so you can be anywhere from a poor to a hyper responder for both the fatigue and the fitness, the stimulus and the fatigue. And you can get more fatigue resistant, like Jeff has done. You can train with more volume, you can acclimate to it, you can build up your resilience, and you really should acclimate. I think the mistake anyone would make, whether you end up being a high responder to volume in terms of the stimulus or not so much, is you don't want to just jump into it. You do want to go like a 10 to 20%, at most 30% increase from where you are, and then see how that goes for a while. And then if you find what Jeff found, it'll be obvious. Okay, I'm barely making it through this, but I'm getting nothing out of it. And also, I will say it's been obvious for me too. As soon as I turn over that one rock, I saw a pretty substantial response. I think you should only be doing this if you're plateaued. Because I tell you one thing, I never increased my volume while I was still progressing. I did it because I was plateaued.
Right.
That's the right mindset, in my opinion. Not hoping the grass is greener, not being insecure, not being impatient, and not trying to fast track something when you haven't developed the other skills. I don't think you need to take 8 years to do it, but I do think that you want to see multiple experiments of, say, like 3 to 6 months where you've tried a higher volume approach if you're plateaued, and not only did you give yourself time to acclimate to it, but you saw a better outcome, and then you repeat that a couple times. So, Jeff, anything else that you want to say on this topic before we close it out?
No, man, I'm just happy that we did this, so we have a link that we can give to people when they ask us why you do so much volume and why I do so little.
Thanks, everyone, for catching this episode of both Pragmatic Bodybuilding and Believe 2024.